The Recipe Book of Second Chances. Chapter 1: The Empty Nest Syndrome. Or, what now? They say when your children leave home, you're supposed to feel sad. Lost, even. Like a bird whose nest has been blown away by the wind, leaving you perched on a bare branch, wondering what happened to all those years. I felt something else entirely. Confused. For 43 years, I'd been mother. Capital M. The woman who knew exactly what to do at any given moment. Pack lunches, attend parent-teacher conferences, mediate sibling disputes, nurse fevers, celebrate victories, mend broken hearts. My days had rhythm, purpose, a satisfying exhaustion that came from being needed. Now I stood in my kitchen at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, staring at the refrigerator like it was a modern art installation I couldn't quite understand. Inside, 1 carton of milk, 3 eggs, half a head of lettuce going brown at the edges, and a jar of pickles that had been there so long it might qualify for historical preservation. "Mom, you should join a book club or something," my daughter Sarah had said last week during our video call. She was in Seattle now. Some fancy job with a tech company. Something about user experience design for mobile applications. I nodded and smiled like I understood. Or take up yoga. My son David had suggested the week before, calling from his apartment in Chicago where he worked as an architect. "It's really good for flexibility at your age, Ma." At my age. I was 67, not ancient. My knees worked just fine. Thank you very much. But they were right about one thing. I needed something to do. The house felt too big now. Too quiet. Here in suburban Portland, Oregon, the silence was even more pronounced. No traffic noise, no neighbors close enough to hear. Just me and the hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional bark from the Hendersons' dog next door. Even my friends had drifted away over the years. Not dramatically, not with any big argument, but slowly, like water evaporating from a pot you forgot on the stove. 1 missed coffee date because David had a fever. 1 declined invitation because Sarah had a dance recital. 1 year. Then 5. Then 20. I'd bumped into Margaret at Trader Joe's last month. We'd been close once, back before children, before life got complicated. We stood there with our shopping carts, smiling awkwardly, promising to have lunch soon. Neither of us suggested a date. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle around me, and thought, is this it? Is this all there is now? Then I remembered. The recipe box. I found it the next morning in the back of my closet, under a stack of old photo albums I'd been meaning to organize for approximately 15 years. The box was wooden, hand-carved, the size of a small shoebox. My mother had given it to me when I got married, and her mother had given it to her, and so on back through generations of women whose names I knew only as faded pencil marks on yellowed recipe cards. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it with the reverence of an archaeologist unsealing a tomb. The smell hit me first. Cinnamon and clove, vanilla and nutmeg, a ghost of all the meals that had been cooked from these instructions. The cards inside were a mess. Some in my grandmother's slanted cursive. Some in my great-grandmother's perfect Palmer method penmanship. Some with splatters and stains that told their own stories. Grease spots from fried chicken. A brown ring from a coffee cup. A smudge that might have been chocolate, or might have been something else entirely. But there, on top, was a card in my mother's neat script. Nana Rose's Sunday pot roast. I lifted it out, and just like that, I was 8 years old again, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table in her little house in upstate New York. The house that smelled like fresh bread and wood smoke. Where the linoleum was always spotless. Where Nana Rose moved through her tiny kitchen like a dancer. Tasting, adjusting, creating magic from ordinary ingredients. "Mama," I'd asked her once, "why do you cook everything from scratch? Why not just buy the frozen dinners like Susan's mom does?" She'd looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "Because cooking is memory, sweet pea. When you cook your grandmother's recipe, you keep her alive. You pass her love forward." At the time, I thought she was being melodramatic. Now, holding that recipe card, my mother's handwriting a bridge across the years since she'd passed, I understood. I looked at my empty kitchen. At the afternoon light streaming through the windows. At all the time I suddenly had. And I thought, why not? The first challenge was finding the ingredients. Nana Rose's recipe called for things I hadn't thought about in decades. A proper chuck roast from a butcher, not wrapped in plastic from the supermarket. Fresh thyme and rosemary, not the dried stuff in jars. Root vegetables that still had dirt on them. The supermarket was overwhelming. When had everything become so packaged, so processed? I wandered through the aisles feeling like a time traveler, squinting at labels that promised, just like homemade, and traditional recipe, when I knew for a fact they contained neither homemade effort nor traditional anything. Finally, I found a butcher shop in the old part of downtown Portland. The kind of place with sawdust on the floor, and a man behind the counter who looked like he'd been born holding a cleaver. "I need a chuck roast," I said. £3, well marbled. "And I need you to not look at me like I'm crazy when I say I want it with the bone in if possible." He grinned. "Lady, you're speaking my language. Haven't had someone ask for a proper roast in weeks. Everyone wants chicken breasts and ground turkey." He said it with the disdain of a man who understood meat. "You making pot roast? My grandmother's recipe." "Ah." He nodded like I'd just shared a secret password. "In that case, let me get you something special." 20 minutes later, I left with not just a roast, but also recommendations for a farmer's market. A store that sold real herbs. And a lecture on the declining quality of modern vegetables that I found oddly comforting. Cooking the roast took all day. Not because it was difficult. Though my hands had forgotten the muscle memory of peeling and chopping, and I had to stop twice to look up what "sear until deeply browned" actually meant. But because I kept stopping to read the card. To trace my mother's handwriting with my finger. To remember. The smell, though. Oh, the smell. As the roast braised in the oven, the house filled with an aroma I hadn't experienced in 20 years. Rich beef, sweet carrots, earthy herbs. It smelled like Sunday dinners at Nana Rose's table. Like my mother's kitchen when I was young. Like home. I set the table for one, which felt ridiculous and sad in equal measure. But when I finally sat down and took that first bite, something inside me cracked open. It tasted exactly right. Exactly like memory. The meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. The gravy was rich and complex. The vegetables had absorbed all the flavors, and transformed into something greater than the sum of their parts. I cried into my pot roast. Which probably wasn't what Nana Rose had intended. But there you have it. And then I did something impulsive. I took out my phone and texted Margaret. The same Margaret from Trader Joe's. whose number I'd kept in my contacts for 5 years without ever using it. Made my grandmother's pot roast. Have enough for 4. Come over? 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Tomorrow? Tonight. While it's still hot. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Chapter 2. The Language of Leftovers. Margaret arrived with wine and apprehension in equal measure. I could see it in the way she stood on my porch, clutching the bottle like a shield, her smile bright and nervous. I couldn't remember if you drank red or white, so I brought both, she said, holding up a second bottle she'd been hiding behind her back. Margaret, we're having pot roast, not facing a firing squad. She laughed, but it was shaky. I know, It's been so long, Helen. What if we don't have anything to talk about? Then we'll talk about how we don't have anything to talk about. Come in before the food gets cold. The thing about old friends is that even after years of silence, your bodies remember how to be together. Margaret kicked off her shoes by the door without being asked, headed straight to the kitchen, and started pulling down plates from the cabinet like she lived here. Still keeping the good china on the top shelf? Where else would I keep it? That's where china goes. Most people use their good china. Most people are wrong. We carried our plates to the dining room. I'd reheated enough for both of us, and made fresh mashed potatoes because pot roast without mashed potatoes is like a hug without the squeeze. And sat across from each other at the table that had hosted so many family dinners, so many homework sessions, so many fights about curfews and car privileges. Margaret took her first bite and closed her eyes. Oh my God. Right? This is. Helen, this is incredible. When did you become a chef? I'm not a chef. I'm just following my grandmother's recipe. Well, your grandmother was a genius. She took another bite, then another. Why haven't you been cooking like this all along? I thought about how to answer that. I cooked, I said finally. But it was different. It was meal planning and grocery shopping and making sure everyone got their vegetables. It was chicken nuggets for David because he wouldn't eat anything else for 2 years. It was remembering Sarah was lactose intolerant before that dinner party. It was fuel, not this. Not love? I loved them. Loved them. But the cooking was about efficiency, about getting everyone fed and out the door. There wasn't time for recipes that take all day. For ingredients you have to hunt down. I pushed a carrot around my plate. I forgot that cooking could be something I did for myself. That it could be pleasure, not just duty. Margaret set down her fork. I did the same thing with painting. You painted? In college. Before I met Robert, before the kids, I was going to be an artist. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then life happened. And somewhere along the way, I put away my easel and forgot I'd ever wanted to be anything but mom. We sat with that for a moment. 2 women on the other side of motherhood. Realizing what we'd lost along the way. So why now? Margaret asked. Why did you start cooking again? I told her about the empty nest. About the confusion. About finding the recipe box. As I talked, I pulled out more recipe cards to show her. My great-grandmother's apple pie. My mother's chicken and dumplings. Nana Rose's famous dinner rolls that were apparently so good they'd caused a minor scandal at a church potluck in 1952. There are stories in here, I said, holding up a card for something called depression cake. A chocolate cake made without eggs, milk, or butter because those things were scarce. My great-grandmother made this when they had nothing. She still made her family a birthday cake. Margaret picked up another card. This one splattered with what looked like tomato sauce. Cousin Ida's lasagna. There's a note. Double the cheese or she'll know. Cousin Ida took her lasagna very seriously. There's a whole world in this box. A whole family. We finished the pot roast. Polished off the mashed potatoes. Drank both bottles of wine. It turned out we were red wine women who knew. And talked until midnight. About our kids, yes, but also about ourselves. About who we'd been before children. About who we might still become. When Margaret finally left, we hugged at the door. A real hug. Not the brief squeeze of acquaintances. Same time next week? She asked. I'll cook something else from the box. And I'll bring my old sketches. Maybe it's time to see if I remember how to draw. After she left, I cleaned the kitchen with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. As I washed the dishes, I noticed there were no leftovers. We'd eaten everything. Which Nana Rose always said was the highest compliment you could pay a cook. I picked up the recipe box and rifled through the cards, wondering what to make next. So many options. So many stories waiting to be told. That's when I realized. I wasn't just cooking food. I was excavating my own history. Reconnecting with the women who'd come before me. And maybe, just maybe, rebuilding the connections I'd let slip away. Chapter 3: The Great Baking Disaster. Or, Pride Comes Before the Fall. Emboldened by my pot roast success, I decided to tackle something more ambitious. Nana Rose's legendary apple pie. This was not just any apple pie. According to family lore, this pie had won 3 county fair ribbons, inspired 2 marriage proposals, and once caused Uncle Henry to weep openly at the Thanksgiving table. My mother had attempted it exactly twice. Once for my wedding, once for Sarah's baptism. And both times declared she'd never do it again, because the crust was temperamental as a cat in a rainstorm. But I was riding high on pot roast confidence and Margaret's praise. How hard could it be? The recipe card was more detailed than the others, as if Nana Rose knew this one required serious instruction. It was also covered in cryptic notes. Keep everything cold. Don't overwork. If sweating, stop and chill again. It read less like a recipe and more like a hostage negotiation. I should have taken that as a warning. Instead, I invited not just Margaret, but also 2 other old friends I'd tracked down through Facebook. Joyce, who'd moved back to Portland after her divorce, and Patricia, who'd been in my book club approximately 17 years ago before the book club dissolved due to everyone being too busy to read books. I'm making my grandmother's famous apple pie, I'd announced in our group text, which I'd boldly named the Second Act Club. The one from the stories? Patricia had replied. The legendary pie? The very same. Helen, are you sure? Didn't your mother swear off making it? My mother was a wonderful woman, but she had no patience for temperamental dough. I, on the other hand, have nothing but time. Pride goeth before a fall. And all that. The trouble started immediately. The recipe called for the butter to be cold as winter. I took this literally, cutting up sticks straight from the freezer, and trying to work them into the flour with a pastry cutter, which was harder than it sounded, and gave me an arm workout I hadn't anticipated. This is ridiculous, I muttered, trying to cut through butter that had the consistency of concrete. Nana Rose did this without complaining. Nana Rose did this without air conditioning in a kitchen that was probably 90 degrees. Nana Rose was also, I was beginning to suspect, some kind of sorceress. After 15 minutes of battle, I had something that looked less like pie dough and more like a crime scene. The butter was still in visible chunks. The flour was everywhere. In my hair, on my glasses, coating the counter like snow. I checked the recipe again. Dough should come together easily and feel tender. My dough did not come together easily. My dough felt like it was actively resisting me. Like it knew I was an imposter. I tried adding more water. Then less water. Then I started over completely. This time with the butter slightly less frozen. On my third attempt, I finally got something that resembled actual dough, though it required more four-letter words than Nana Rose's recipe had mentioned. Then came rolling it out. On a floured surface, the recipe said cheerfully, roll dough into a circle approximately 12 inches in diameter. Approximately, it turned out, was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. My first attempt produced something that looked less like a circle and more like a map of Italy. My second attempt created what could generously be called an amoeba. My third attempt, after I'd chilled the dough again because I was indeed sweating, finally produced something roundish. Getting it into the pie dish was another adventure entirely. It ripped. It tore. It stuck to the counter despite all the flour I'd used. By the time I'd patched it together, it looked like Frankenstein's monster had taken up baking. It'll be fine once it's baked, I told myself, moving on to the filling. The apples, at least, cooperated. I peeled and sliced while listening to a podcast about women who'd reinvented themselves after 50. Which felt appropriate. 6 cups of Granny Smith apples, tossed with sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a secret ingredient the recipe listed only as NR's special touch. I stared at those 2 words for 5 full minutes before remembering. Nana Rose always added a splash of bourbon to her apple pies. Just enough to deepen the flavor. Not enough for Uncle Henry to get drunk at Thanksgiving. Though that had happened once, leading to the aforementioned tears. I added the bourbon. Filled the pie. Attempted to create a lattice top crust, which was supposed to be decorative and allow steam to escape. What I created was more abstract art than decorative, but I pressed on. Egg wash on top, a sprinkle of sugar, and into the oven it went. The doorbell rang just as I was shoving the pie in. I opened it to find Margaret, Joyce, and Patricia on my porch, all holding wine bottles and looking expectant. "It smells amazing," Joyce said, pulling me into a hug. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her, and her hair was shorter, streaked with silver she was wearing proudly. "I can smell it from the street." "That's probably a good sign?" I said, suddenly nervous. I'd been so focused on making the pie that I hadn't thought about what would happen if it was terrible. We settled in the living room with wine while we waited. It was awkward at first. 5 years apart will do that. But Margaret had brought photos from her sketchpad. Charcoal drawings of Portland landscapes that were actually quite beautiful. And that got us talking. I'd forgotten how much I loved this. Margaret said, showing us a drawing of the St. John's Bridge at sunset. "The way you can lose yourself in creating something." "I've been thinking about that," Patricia said, "about how we all gave up our hobbies when we had kids. I used to garden. Really garden. Not just mowing the lawn and pulling weeds. I had roses. I entered competitions." "What happened?" I asked. She shrugged. "Kids needed soccer practice. Husband needed dinner. Job needed overtime. Garden seemed selfish. But it wasn't selfish, Joyce said quietly. It was yours. We all sat with that for a moment. 4 women who'd spent decades putting everyone else first. Now trying to remember what it felt like to want something just for ourselves. The timer went off. I pulled the pie from the oven. And my heart sank. The crust had burned around the edges. The lattice top looked more like a fishing net designed by a drunk person. And when I poked it with a knife to check if the apples were done, filling bubbled out of a crack I hadn't noticed, oozing down the side like lava. Well, I said, staring at my disaster. It's definitely cooked. Margaret came into the kitchen and looked at the pie. Helen. I know. Helen. I know. It's actually kind of impressionistic? Despite everything, I started laughing. And once I started, I couldn't stop. Margaret joined in. Then Patricia and Joyce appeared in the doorway. Took one look at the pie. And lost it completely. Your grandmother's legendary pie, Joyce gasped between giggles. The one that inspired marriage proposals, Patricia added. The one that made Uncle Henry cry, Margaret finished. In my defense, I said, wiping my eyes, Uncle Henry was drunk on the bourbon in the filling. We served the pie anyway. And here's the thing. It was ugly as sin. But it tasted incredible. The filling was perfect. Sweet and tart and spiced just right, with that hint of bourbon adding depth. The crust, where it wasn't burned, was flaky and tender. It wasn't pretty, but it was delicious. Nana Rose would understand, Margaret said, taking another slice. Sometimes the best meals are the ones that didn't go according to plan. Sometimes the best friendships are too, Patricia added, raising her wine glass. Here's to second chances, and to Helen's brave pie. To ugly pies that taste like love, Joyce amended. We clinked glasses. 4 women in our 60s and 70s. Sitting around a kitchen table with a disaster of a pie that somehow tasted like home. And I realized. This was what I'd been missing. Not perfection. Not even success, really. Just this. Connection, laughter, the willingness to try something and fail spectacularly. And try again anyway. I pulled out the recipe box and showed them the other cards. We spent the rest of the evening planning our next gatherings. Patricia would host, and I'd make Cousin Ida's lasagna. Joyce would host after that, and I'd attempt the chicken and dumplings. Margaret would finally work up the courage to show us more of her art. As they left that night, Patricia hugged me at the door. Thank you for this, she said. I'd forgotten what it felt like to laugh like that. Me too, I admitted. After they'd gone, I looked at the remains of the pie. Half-eaten, ugly, perfect. I took a photo and texted it to Sarah and David. Made Nana Rose's apple pie. It's not as pretty as hers, but I think she'd approve. Sarah responded first. Mom, you're cooking again? Can you make it when I visit next month? Then David. I haven't had that pie since I was a kid. Save me a slice? I looked at the pie. Then at the empty plates where 4 women had sat and talked and laughed. At the recipe box full of stories waiting to be told. At my kitchen. Which finally smelled like a home again instead of just a house. Come visit. I typed back. I'll make it fresh. Chapter 4. The dinner party. Or. When you accidentally start a movement. Word of my cooking adventures spread in the way that news spreads among women of a certain age. Mysteriously, efficiently, and with the speed of wildfire in August. I'm not entirely sure how it happened. Margaret might have mentioned it to someone at her ceramics class. Patricia definitely posted photos of the ugly but delicious apple pie on Facebook. Joyce, I discovered later, had been telling everyone at her yoga studio about this amazing friend who's rediscovering traditional cooking. The result was that my phone started ringing. Actually ringing, not buzzing with texts. Which should have been my first clue that this was serious. Helen, this is Barbara Kendrick. We met at that charity auction 3 years ago? I heard you're doing traditional cooking from family recipes and I was wondering. Helen, it's Susan Chen from the library board. Patricia says you're making your grandmother's food? I have my grandmother's recipes too, and I thought maybe. Is this Helen Martinez? My friend Joyce gave me your number. I'm terrible at cooking, but my mother's recipes are sitting in a drawer and I thought. Before I quite understood what was happening, I'd agreed to host a dinner party. For 12 people. Most of whom I barely knew. This is insane, I told Margaret when she came over to help me plan. I can't cook for 12 people. I burned an apple pie. I've made exactly one successful pot roast. You can absolutely cook for 12 people, Margaret said, pulling out a notepad. You just need organization. And help. And probably more wine. That last one I can do. We planned the menu like military generals planning an invasion. From the recipe box, we selected Nana Rose's pot roast. Proven success. Great-Grandma May's green beans with bacon. Simple, hard to mess up. Aunt Louise's yeast rolls. Which came with a note saying, allow time for rising, cannot rush. And for dessert, my mother's blackberry cobbler, which had the advantage of being nearly impossible to ruin. Everyone's bringing something too, Margaret added. Barbara's bringing wine. Susan's bringing a salad. Joyce is bringing her mother's kimchi, which apparently goes with everything. This is starting to sound less like a dinner party and more like a potluck. It's a community gathering, Margaret corrected. Which is what food is supposed to be anyway, right? Your grandmother didn't cook in isolation. She cooked for people. With people. She had a point. The day of the dinner party arrived with the kind of perfect September weather that makes Portland famous. Crisp air, golden light, the last warm breath before fall really settles in. I'd spent the morning prepping, with Margaret as my sous chef and moral support. Rolls are rising, she announced. Pot roast is in. Green beans are prepped. You're doing great. I'm panicking. You're doing that too, but mostly you're doing great. The guests started arriving at 6. Barbara Kendrick came first, with enough wine for 20 people. I wasn't sure if we were red or white drinkers, so I brought both. And champagne. And a nice port for after. Susan Chen arrived with her grandmother's recipe box and tears in her eyes. I haven't looked at these since she died. I was too sad. But hearing about what you're doing. She trailed off, clutching the box like a lifeline. Joyce brought her mother's kimchi. And 3 of her yoga students who'd heard about the dinner and begged to come. Patricia brought an old friend from her gardening competition days. Along with her ex-husband Tom and his new wife Linda, who turned out to be delightful. We stayed friends after the divorce, she explained with a shrug. Life's too short for bitterness. Margaret brought her adult daughter Emma, who was visiting from California. By 6:30, my house was full of men and women ranging from their 30s to their 80s. All talking at once, all clutching wine glasses, and all, I realized with a start. Hungry for more than just food. We ate buffet style because sitting 12 people at my dining table would have required physics-defying skills. Instead, we filled plates and scattered throughout the house. Some at the table, some on the couch, some sitting on the floor. Like we were at a college party instead of a gathering of mostly retirement-aged women. The pot roast was, thank God, perfect again. The rolls, after I'd nearly given up on them rising, had come through gloriously. The green beans were simple but flavorful. And Joyce's kimchi did indeed go with everything, adding a bright, spicy contrast to the rich beef. But the real magic wasn't the food. It was what happened while we ate. Susan opened her grandmother's recipe box and started reading cards aloud. Grandma Lily's dumplings. The ones she made every Sunday. She learned this from her mother in China before she immigrated. Her voice cracked. I never learned how to make them. I kept meaning to ask her to teach me, but I was always too busy. And then she was gone. It's not too late. Barbara said gently. You have the recipe. You can learn now. But it won't be the same. No, I said. Thinking about my burned pie. My imperfect pot roast. It won't be the same. But that doesn't mean it won't be good. That doesn't mean it won't matter. Patricia pulled out photos on her phone. Her garden, before she'd given it up. Roses in full bloom, meticulously cared for, beautiful. I'm starting again, she announced. Just a small bed in the backyard. Margaret's been sketching. Helen's been cooking. I can grow roses. Emma, Margaret's daughter, had been quiet most of the evening. Now she spoke up. Can I just say? You're all incredible. Seriously. My generation is obsessed with finding ourselves and living authentically. But you're actually doing it. At an age when everyone says you're supposed to be winding down. You're starting up again. We're not starting, Margaret said. We're continuing. We put ourselves on pause for a few decades. That's all. Several decades, Joyce corrected, and everyone laughed. The thing is, I said, surprising myself by speaking. I spent 43 years being mom. And I loved it. I don't regret it. But somewhere in all that mothering, I forgot that I was also Helen. That I had things I loved to do just for the sake of doing them. The recipe box reminded me. So what now? Susan asked. We all just rediscover ourselves? Why not? Patricia said. Helen's cooking. Margaret's sketching. I'm gardening. What's your thing? I don't know. That's the problem. I gave up so much that I can't remember what I liked before. Then we'll help you figure it out, Barbara said. That's what this is, right? We're helping each other remember who we are. The dinner party lasted until nearly midnight. The blackberry cobbler was devoured. The wine bottles emptied. At some point, someone, I think it was Joyce, suggested we make this a regular thing. Once or twice a month, she proposed. We rotate houses. Helen cooks from her recipe box, and we all, I don't know, work on our projects. Support each other. Remember who we are. Like a club? Susan asked. Better than a club, Margaret said. Like a family. The family we choose. Before the night ended, we'd made a schedule. Next time would be at Patricia's house. I'd make Cousin Ida's lasagna. And Patricia would give us a tour of her new rose bed. The next time would be at Joyce's. I'd attempt Great-Grandma May's fried chicken. And Joyce would teach us meditation. Susan volunteered her house for December. I'd make the Christmas feast from the recipe box. And Susan would try her grandmother's dumplings. I'll learn by then. If successful, I'd teach anyone who wants to learn. As everyone left, Susan pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said. "I know this started as just you cooking for friends. But it became something more. You gave us permission to want things for ourselves again." After they'd all gone, I cleaned up with Margaret and Emma, the three of us moving easily around my kitchen. "Mom," Emma said, "I'm jealous. My generation has coffee meetups and networking events. But this? This is real community. You should start one in California," Margaret suggested. "Maybe I will." Later, lying in bed, I looked at the recipe box on my nightstand. Such a small thing, really. Just a wooden box full of old cards. But it had become a portal. To the past, yes, but also to something new. To connection. To possibility. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Mom, your Instagram posts are making me so hungry. Can I bring Mark when I visit? He wants to try Nana Rosa's recipes." I smiled. Sarah bringing her partner home to try my cooking. David asking for pie. My house full of laughter and women reclaiming themselves. "Of course," I typed back. "I'll make the pot roast." Chapter 5. The Thanksgiving Revolution. October arrived with the kind of dramatic weather that reminded you that Oregon had real seasons. Summer's warmth giving way to autumn's chill. Leaves turning gold and crimson. Before the winter rains began. We were transitioning now, which made my kitchen feel even cozier. As I worked my way through the recipe box, I'd gotten bolder. The lasagna at Patricia's house had been a triumph. Though we'd nearly had a diplomatic incident when I'd added extra cheese without Cousin Ida's permission. She'd been dead for 20 years, but apparently her lasagna preferences were still taken seriously. The fried chicken at Joyce's had been crispy and perfect. Though I'd learned the hard way that frying chicken requires more paper towels than any reasonable person would think necessary. Our little group had grown. Emma had indeed started a similar gathering in San Francisco, and video called us during our sessions. Two of Joyce's yoga students, Michelle and Diane, had become regulars. Barbara had brought her sister. Even Linda, Patricia's ex-husband's new wife, had shown up once without Tom. Which could have been awkward, but instead turned into a long conversation about prize-winning roses and second chances. But now, as October gave way to November, I was facing my greatest challenge yet. Thanksgiving. "You should host," Margaret said during our planning session. "You have the biggest house. You've been cooking from the recipe box all fall. It makes sense." "Thanksgiving is not a recipe box dinner," I protested. "Thanksgiving is sacred. Thanksgiving is turkey and stuffing, and 3 kinds of pie, and everyone arguing about whether sweet potatoes should have marshmallows. So do that, but do it your way. With the family recipes." I looked at the recipe box, which I now kept on my kitchen counter instead of hidden in the closet. There were Thanksgiving recipes in there. Nana Rosa's sage stuffing. Great-Grandma May's sweet potato casserole, which apparently predated the marshmallow debate. Aunt Louisa's pumpkin pie, with a recipe note that just said, "Extra nutmeg, trust me." "I'd have to invite everyone," I said. "Sarah and David. Their partners. All of you. Your families. It would be at least 20 people." So? So I've never hosted Thanksgiving. I always went to my mother's house. Then to Sarah's house. Then to nowhere because everyone was too busy. Exactly. So start a new tradition. Host it yourself. Make it yours. I called Sarah and David to propose the idea, expecting resistance. Instead, Sarah said, "Oh, thank God. Mark's family does Thanksgiving at a restaurant. Which is nice but weird, and I was not looking forward to it. I've been wanting a real Thanksgiving." David added, "Amy's never done a traditional one. She's from California, and apparently they do something with quinoa and kale that I'm told is very progressive but is definitely not turkey." So that was decided. Thanksgiving at my house. With the recipe box as my guide and 20 people as my audience. No pressure. The week before Thanksgiving, I turned my kitchen into what Margaret described as a cooking laboratory run by a mad scientist. If the mad scientist was a grandmother with very strong opinions about proper seasoning, she wasn't wrong. I had spreadsheets. Actual spreadsheets. With timelines for when each dish needed to start cooking, when it needed to come out, what temperature the oven should be at each stage. I'd downloaded an app that calculated oven space and cook times. I'd even, and I'm not proud of this, created color-coded labels for my refrigerator shelves. "You know it's supposed to be fun, right?" Joyce said, stopping by to drop off her contribution of Korean side dishes. "Fun is what happens after the turkey is cooked and nobody has food poisoning." Very festive. But despite my anxiety, something wonderful was happening. People were calling, texting, showing up with offers of help. Susan wanted to try making her grandmother's dumplings as an appetizer. Patricia offered to make centerpieces with flowers from her newly revived garden. Barbara's sister, who I'd met exactly once, called to ask if she could bring her mother's cranberry relish recipe because it deserves to be made again. The dinner was becoming less Helen's Thanksgiving and more everyone's Thanksgiving. A potluck of memories, traditions, and second chances. Margaret showed up the day before Thanksgiving with her daughter Emma, who'd flown in from San Francisco, and a cooler full of ingredients. "We're here to help," she announced. Emma took the week off work. "I have no other plans. Put us to work." Emma was wearing an apron that said, "I'm just here for the pie," and had her hair tied back like she meant business. "Mom told me about Thanksgiving. I want to be part of this." So we cooked. 3 women of different generations in my kitchen. Me, Margaret, and Emma. Working through recipes that had been passed down through many generations before us. Margaret chopped vegetables while I made the stuffing. Emma tackled the sweet potato casserole, reading Great-Grandma May's instructions aloud with increasing amusement. "It says, butter should be soft but not melted, approximately the consistency of your earlobe. Your great-great-great-grandmother didn't have digital thermometers," I said. "You worked with what you had." "My earlobe?" She was very practical. We laughed as we cooked, and the kitchen filled with smells that seemed to transcend time. Sage and butter, cinnamon and nutmeg, all the scents of Thanksgivings past. Margaret put on music from the 1950s, songs that Nana Rose probably listened to while cooking. Emma video called her friends in San Francisco to show them the most wholesome thing ever. 3 women from different background and generation, making food from recipes that are basically historical documents. At one point, Margaret stopped chopping and just looked around. "Do you realize what this is? We're not just cooking. We're keeping these women alive. Your Nana Rose, your great-grandma May. They're here with us right now." She was right. I could almost feel them. The weight of all those hands that had made these same dishes. The love that had gone into feeding families. The satisfaction of creating something nourishing and delicious from simple ingredients and careful attention. "To the grandmothers," Emma said, raising her glass of wine. "To the grandmothers," we echoed. Thanksgiving Day arrived with cold rain and the kind of gray sky that made being inside feel like a gift rather than a constraint. I was up at 5, putting the turkey in, double-checking my spreadsheets, triple-checking that I had enough chairs. The first guests arrived at noon. Susan with her grandmother's dumplings, which she'd successfully made for the first time and couldn't stop talking about. "They're not as perfect as Grandma Lily's," she kept saying. "But they taste right. They taste like memory." Then came Joyce with her mother's kimchi and 3 types of Korean pancakes. Patricia with her roses arranged in mason jars. Barbara with enough wine to stock a restaurant. Michelle and Diane with homemade bread. More people arrived. Friends, friends of friends. Patricia's ex-husband Tom with his new wife Linda. Margaret's son who'd driven up from Eugene. And then, finally, Sarah and David with their partners. I hadn't seen them in person in 6 months. And the sight of them walking through my door made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Mom," Sarah said, pulling me into a hug. "Something smells incredible." "Everything smells incredible," David corrected, hugging me next. "Did you cook all of this?" "I had help. A lot of help." I introduced them to everyone. My cooking club, my friends, this community that had formed around a recipe box. And a shared desire to reclaim parts of ourselves we'd set aside. Sarah looked around with something like wonder. "Mom, this is amazing. You did this?" "We did this," I corrected. "All of us." 23 people ended up sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner in my house. We'd pushed together every table I owned, borrowed chairs from neighbors, and created what could only be described as organized chaos. The food covered every available surface. Nana Rose's turkey, golden and perfect. The sage stuffing that made the house smell like home. Sweet potato casserole with the perfect balance of sweet and savory. And no marshmallows. Sorry everyone who's wrong about that. Green beans, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce from 3 different family recipes. Susan's dumplings, Joyce's kimchi, fresh bread, rolls still warm from the oven. Before we ate, I stood up, surprising myself. "I want to say something." The room quieted. A few months ago, I found myself alone in an empty house, wondering what came next. I found my grandmother's recipe box and thought I'd just cook a few dinners. But it became more than that. I looked around at all these faces. Old friends, new friends, family, chosen family. These recipes aren't just instructions for making food. They're connections to the women who came before us. They're proof that we can reclaim the parts of ourselves we set aside. They're permission to want things for ourselves again. They're also delicious, Emma added, and everyone laughed. They're also delicious, I agreed. But more than that, they brought us together. They reminded me that food is about community, about sharing not just meals but stories and memories and laughter. So thank you, all of you, for being part of this. To Helen, Margaret raised her glass. To the recipe box, Joyce added. To second chances, Patricia called out. We clinked glasses, a joyful cacophony of crystal and appreciation. And then we ate. The food was perfect. Not in the sense that everything was cooked exactly right. The turkey was slightly dry in places. The gravy had lumps I'd tried to smooth out. One batch of rolls had burned on the bottom. But perfect in the way that mattered. It tasted like love. Like effort. Like generations of women who'd cared enough to write down their secrets and pass them forward. Between courses, people shared their own stories. Susan talked about learning her grandmother's dumplings. How she'd cried the whole time she made them, but felt closer to Grandma Lily than she had in years. Patricia showed photos of her new rose bed. Small but promising. Margaret passed around her sketchpad, showing detailed drawings of Portland landmarks that Emma had convinced her to enter in a local art show. "I never would have done this without all of you," Margaret said. "I'd convinced myself that part of my life was over." "Nothing's over until we decide it's over," Barbara said. "My mother used to say that. I thought she was being corny. Turns out she was right." David pulled me aside while people were serving themselves pie. Pumpkin with extra nutmeg, just like Aunt Louisa's note suggested. Plus apple and pecan because you can't have Thanksgiving with just one pie. "Mom, I'm proud of you," he said. "For what? Cooking a turkey?" "For this. For rebuilding your life. For not just sitting around waiting for Sarah and me to visit. For creating something new." He gestured at the room full of laughter and conversation. "You always took care of us. It's nice to see you taking care of yourself." Sarah joined us, slipping her arm through mine. "David's right. You're different now. Happier. More. You." "I'm the same person I always was." "No," Sarah said gently. "You're the person you were. Before you became just Mom. And that's wonderful." The party lasted until nearly midnight. We ate pie, drank coffee and wine, told stories, laughed until we cried. Tom and Linda ended up talking to Patricia for an hour about gardening. And it was so friendly and normal that I almost forgot they used to be married and now he was married to someone else. Because apparently that's what maturity looks like. Emma started a group chat called The Recipe Box Project, and added everyone who wanted to be part of it. "This needs to spread," she announced. "Everyone should do this. Everyone should dig out their family recipes and cook them and remember." "Very millennial of you to turn it into a movement," David teased. "Very millennial of me to recognize a good thing and want to share it," Emma corrected. As people finally started leaving, they hugged me with a warmth that felt like family. Not the family you're born into, but the family you choose. The family you create by showing up, being vulnerable, sharing what matters. Margaret was the last to leave, helping me load the dishwasher at 1 in the morning while Emma dozed on the couch. "Thank you," I said. "For everything. For that first night when you came over for pot roast. For believing this could be something. Thank you for inviting me. For remembering we used to be friends. For giving us a reason to be friends again." She dried her hands and looked at me seriously. "You know what you did, right? You didn't just cook some recipes. You created a community. You reminded all of us that we're more than just mothers and wives and former employees. We're people. With interests and talents and things we want to do just for ourselves. It was just a recipe box. It was never just a recipe box." Chapter 6: The Recipe for Living. December came with early darkness and the kind of cold that makes you grateful for warm kitchens and good company. Our group had been meeting for 4 months now, and something remarkable had happened. We'd all changed. Patricia's rose bed was planted and mulched for winter, ready to bloom in spring. She'd signed up for a master gardener class and talked about it with the kind of excitement I hadn't heard from her in years. Margaret had entered 3 sketches in a local art show and sold 2 of them. She'd set up a corner of her living room as a studio, and spent most mornings drawing before the light changed. Joyce had gotten certified as a meditation instructor and was teaching classes at the community center. She'd also started leading mindful cooking workshops that combined her mother's Korean recipes with meditation practice. Susan had made her grandmother's dumplings 6 more times, each batch better than the last. She'd invited her own daughter to learn them, passing the tradition forward. And me? I'd cooked my way through half the recipe box and learned something more valuable than any culinary skill. I'd learned that it's never too late to remember who you are. That the things you set aside don't disappear. They wait, patient as old recipes in a wooden box, ready to nourish you again when you're ready. Sarah and Mark's visit in December brought unexpected news. They arrived on a Friday evening, bringing wine and nervous energy. "So," Sarah said over dinner, "I'd made Great-Grandma May's beef stew, perfect for a cold winter night. We have something to tell you." My heart jumped. I knew that tone. That was either very good news or very bad news. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said, and then burst into tears. I know it's not a bad thing. I don't know why I'm crying. Because it's overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once? I suggested, pulling her into a hug while my own eyes filled with tears. Yes. Exactly that. Mark looked relieved that I was happy. "We were hoping. We know you're busy with your cooking group and your friends. But we thought maybe you could teach Sarah some of the recipes? Before the baby comes? So she can make them for our family?" I looked at my daughter, who'd grown up eating my efficient weeknight dinners, my meal-prepped lunches, my shortcut casseroles made with canned soup and frozen vegetables, because that's what busy working mothers did. She'd never tasted Nana Rosa's pot roast, or Great-Grandma May's sweet potato casserole, or any of the dishes that lived in the recipe box, because I'd been too busy surviving to cook them. "Of course," I said. "We'll cook together. I'll teach you everything." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I want our baby to know these recipes. To know where they came from. I want them to taste Nana Rosa's love, even though they'll never meet her. That's what food does," I said, thinking about all the women in the recipe box. All the hands that had shaped these dishes. It connects us across time. It keeps people alive. We spent Sarah's visit cooking together, filling my freezer with meals she could reheat during those exhausted early months of new parenthood. But more than that, we talked. Really talked. Not the surface level, how's work, conversations we'd been having for years. But deep discussions about motherhood, identity, fear, hope. "Were you scared?" Sarah asked while rolling out dough for biscuits. "When you had me?" "Terrified. Absolutely terrified. But you always seemed so confident. Like you knew exactly what you were doing." "I was faking it. Every parent is faking it. We're all just doing our best and hoping we don't mess up too badly." "Did you ever regret it? Giving up your life for us?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I didn't regret having you. Never. But did I sometimes wonder who I might have been if I'd made different choices? If I'd pursued my own interests? If I'd stayed connected with my friends? Yes. And I think that's okay. You can love your children completely and still mourn the parts of yourself you set aside. Is that why you started cooking again? To find those parts? Maybe. Or maybe I just needed to remember that I was Helen before I was Mom. That I'm still Helen now that you don't need me the same way. Sarah stopped rolling and looked at me. I still need you, Mom. Just differently. I know. And I'm here. But I'm also allowed to be here for myself too. David came to visit the following week with Amy, and I taught them how to make Nana Rose's Sunday pot roast. David, who'd barely boiled water in his adult life, took to it with unexpected enthusiasm. This is meditative, he said, carefully browning the meat. I get why you like this. It's not just the cooking, I said. It's the connection. When I make these recipes, I feel close to the women who made them before me. I understand them better. Their lives, their values, what they cared about. Amy, who'd been quiet most of the afternoon, spoke up. My grandmother had recipes like this. In Polish. I can't read them. She died before I thought to ask her to translate. Maybe you could find someone to translate them, I suggested. It's not too late. That's what this whole thing has taught me, David said. It's never too late. You're proof of that, Mom. You started over at 67. If you can do that, I can learn to cook a pot roast. We ate together that night, David and Amy and me around my kitchen table, passing dishes and stories and laughter. And I realized, this was what I'd been missing. Not just cooking, but this connection. The kind of deep, meaningful time with my children that gets lost in the shuffle of busy lives. I'm sorry, I said suddenly. They both looked at me, confused. For what? David asked. For all the years I was too busy to do this. To really cook, to really talk. I was so focused on taking care of you that I forgot to just be with you. Mom, David said gently, you have nothing to apologize for. You did your best. You were there for us always. We turned out okay, didn't we? You turned out amazing. But I wish I'd known then what I know now. That I could be a good mother and still be myself. That those things weren't mutually exclusive. So teach that to your grandchild, Amy suggested. Break the cycle. Show them it's possible to be both. Our cooking group met for the last time this year in December at my house. We changed from Susan's house to my own, following a disastrous incident involving the kitchen and her daughter. For what we'd started calling our solstice celebration. A secular gathering focused on light, warmth, and gratitude as the year turned. I'd made dishes from the recipe box that felt appropriate for celebration. Nana Rose's crown roast, Aunt Louisa's Parker house rolls, Great-Grandma May's layer cake that required so much patience I'd nearly given up 3 times. But the highlight wasn't my food. It was what everyone else brought. Susan brought her grandmother's dumplings and her daughter Emily, who'd learned to make them too. 4 generations, Susan said, her voice thick with emotion. My grandmother, my mother, me, Emily. The recipe continues. Patricia brought roses from her garden. Winter roses she'd coaxed into blooming, defying the season through sheer determination and skill. They're not perfect, she said, but they're mine. Margaret brought a painting. An actual painting, not a sketch. A watercolor of our first dinner together, the night of the pot roast, capturing something essential about the warmth and connection of that evening. I'm having a show in February, she announced. A real show, at a real gallery. And you're all invited. Joyce brought her mother and her mother's recipe box. I wanted Mom to meet all of you. To see what you inspired. She's going to teach us her recipes. Pass them down properly this time. Joyce's mother. A tiny woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile. Bowed slightly. Thank you for reminding my daughter who she is, she said in accented English. Thank you for reminding all of you. We ate and drank and celebrated as the shortest day of the year faded into the longest night. And as we did, I looked around at these women. These incredible, resilient, creative women who'd taken a chance on a pot roast invitation and turned it into something transformative. Speech. Barbara called out, and everyone laughed. But they also looked at me expectantly. Okay, I said, standing. Here's what I've learned from the recipe box. Food is never just food. It's love made tangible. It's memory made delicious. It's connection made possible. When I cook Nana Rose's recipes, I'm not just following instructions. I'm honoring her life, her work, her love. I'm saying, you mattered. What you did mattered. You're not forgotten. I paused, emotion catching in my throat. But more than that, I've learned that it's never too late to remember who you are. To pick up the things you set aside. To start again. We're not old. We're not done. We're not just waiting for our lives to be over. We're living. Right now. Together. To living. Margaret raised her glass. To second chances. Patricia added. To the recipe box, Susan said, and to Helen for opening it. To all of us, I said, for having the courage to begin again. Chapter 7. The Legacy. Or, what we pass forward. Spring came early that year, arriving in March with unexpected warmth and the kind of optimism that makes you believe anything is possible. Sarah had her baby some time later. A girl they named Rose, after Nana Rose, which made me cry for approximately 3 hours. I flew to Seattle to help, and spent 2 weeks cooking for them. Filling their freezer with meals from the recipe box. While cradling my granddaughter and whispering to her about the women she came from. Your great-great-grandmother Rose, I told her as she slept in my arms, was a woman who believed that love could be cooked into food. That feeding people was a sacred act. She would have adored you. Sarah, exhausted and overwhelmed in the way all new mothers are, watched me make pot roast in her kitchen. Teach me again, Mom. Slowly this time. I want to remember every step. So we cooked together, baby Rose in her bassinet nearby, and I showed Sarah not just how to make the recipes, but why they mattered. The stories behind each dish. The women who'd created them. The love that had been folded into every instruction. Someday, Sarah said, I'll teach Rose. And she'll teach her children. And Nana Rose's recipes will live on. Not just her recipes, I said. Her love. That's what we're really passing down. Back home in Portland, our cooking group had evolved into something more formal. Emma had convinced us to start a blog. The Second Act Kitchen. Where we posted recipes and stories about reclaiming our identities after decades of putting others first. It went viral. Not in a dramatic way, but in the steady, powerful way that happens when you tap into something universal. Women from around the country, around the world, started emailing us. Sharing their own recipe boxes. Their own stories of rediscovery. I'm 72 and I just picked up my paintbrushes for the first time in 40 years. I found my mother's sewing patterns in the attic. I'm going to learn to make her dresses. I'm 65 and I'm starting a garden. It's never too late. Margaret's art show in February had been a success. She'd sold half her paintings and gotten commissioned for 3 more. She was now teaching drawing classes at the community center, helping other women reconnect with their artistic sides. Patricia had won 3rd place in a regional rose competition. 3rd place. At 68. With roses she'd only been growing for 6 months. Joyce didn't stop her meditation classes at the community center, combining her mother's Korean cooking with mindfulness practice, in a way that was uniquely hers. Susan had published her grandmother's dumpling recipe in a local food magazine, along with the story of learning to make them after decades of the recipe sitting in a drawer. And me? I'd been approached by a small publisher about turning the recipe box into a cookbook. Not just the recipes, but the stories. The women. The legacy. I hosted one final dinner party before the cookbook went to print. Everyone came. The original group, our expanded circle, Sarah and baby Rose, David and Amy, even Emma who flew in from San Francisco. The house was full of noise and laughter and the smells of all the recipes I'd learned to make. It was chaotic and beautiful and exactly what Nana Rose would have wanted. After dinner, I brought out the recipe box. It was worn now, handled more in the past 9 months than in the previous 20 years. But it was also loved. Used. Alive. This box, I said, holding it up, changed my life. It reminded me that I'm not just a mother or a grandmother. I'm Helen. I'm a woman with interests and talents and things I want to do. And I'm allowed to want those things. We all are. I looked at little Rose, asleep in Sarah's arms. Someday, this box will be yours. And hopefully, you'll add your own recipes to it. Your own stories. Your own legacy. But more than that, I hope you'll never forget who you are. I hope you'll never set aside your passions for so long that you forget you have them. Speech is getting heavy, Grandma, David teased gently. Let me finish, I said. What I want to say is, thank you. To all of you. For being part of this. For showing me that it's possible to start over. That it's never too late to remember who you are. That community and connection and cooking with love are the things that make life worth living. I opened the box and pulled out a new recipe card. One I'd written myself. Grandma Helen's pot roast. It read. The recipe that started it all. Make this when you're feeling lost. Make this when you need to remember who you are. Make this when you want to bring people together. Make this with love. I put it in the box, on top of all the others. My recipe. My story. My contribution to the legacy. Now, I said, who wants cake? Later, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the recipe box. I thought about Nana Rose, about my mother, about all the women who'd come before me. Women who'd cooked and cared and created, who'd sometimes lost themselves in the service of others, but whose love lived on in recipes and memories. I thought about Sarah and little Rose, about the generations yet to come, about the recipes they'd add to the box, the stories they'd tell, the love they'd pass forward. And I thought about myself. About Helen. About the woman I'd been, the woman I'd become, the woman I was still becoming. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. Thank you for tonight. Thank you for everything. You changed my life. Then Joyce. Same. You gave us permission to want more. Then Patricia. My roses are budding. They'll bloom in September. Just like us. I smiled, tears in my eyes, and looked at the recipe box. Such a small thing to hold so much power. Such simple recipes to create such transformation. But that's the magic of cooking, isn't it? It's never just about the food. It's about love, connection, memory, legacy. It's about the hands that came before us, and the hands that will come after. It's about remembering who we are, and passing that knowledge forward. I opened the box one more time and ran my fingers over the cards. So many stories. So many women. So much love. And then I closed it, satisfied. The recipes would be there when I needed them. The stories would live on. The legacy would continue. But for now, for tonight, I was just Helen. Sitting in my kitchen. Drinking tea. Content. The recipe for living. It turns out, isn't complicated. Remember who you are. Connect with others. Create with love. Pass it forward. And maybe, if you're lucky, someone will find your recipe box years from now and remember you. Remember that you mattered. That what you did mattered. That you loved, and you were loved in return. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be remembered. To matter. To leave something behind that says, I was here. I lived. I loved. The recipe box had taught me that. And for that, I would be forever grateful. Epilogue. A note from Helen. If you're reading this, maybe you've found your own recipe box. Or maybe you're thinking about searching for one. Maybe it's in a closet somewhere, or in your mother's attic, or sitting on a shelf gathering dust. I want to tell you. Open it. I know you're busy. I know you have responsibilities and obligations and 1,000 reasons why now isn't the right time. But here's what I learned. There's never a right time. There's only now. Those recipes aren't just instructions for making food. They're connections to the people who came before you. They're proof that you come from a long line of people who created, who cared, who loved enough to write it all down. And more than that, they're permission. Permission to remember who you were before you became everything to everyone else. Permission to want things for yourself. Permission to start again, no matter how old you are, or how long it's been. So open the box. Make the recipes. Tell the stories. Share them with people you love. Create your own traditions. Add your own cards to the collection. And most importantly, remember that you're not just mom or grandma or wife or employee. You're you. You're a person with interests and talents and dreams. And it's never too late to pursue them. The recipe for living is simple. Love. Connect. Create. Remember. Begin again. I did it at 67. You can do it too. With love. Helen. P.S. Start with the pot roast. It's foolproof. Well, almost.